everybody, welcome to the Sew Essential vlog. I'm Lucy and I'm here today to talk you through our top tips for machine sewn buttonholes. So buttonholes are something that can strike fear into even the most confident of sewists, because quite often it's something that you add at the very end of making the garment. So you've put all that work and all those hours into making something beautiful, and then if the buttonholes go wrong at the end it can spoil the whole thing, which can be heartbreaking of course. So we're sharing with you today our top tips for getting great results every time and avoiding that issue. So we'll be talking about working with different types of fabric. I'll be sharing some products that you can use when you've got bulky fabrics and that sort of thing to tackle, all of which, everything I mentioned today as always is available on our website, and you can find the link to our website below. I'll also put links to the products below for you where I can, and there is a write-up blog post of this video as well that you can refer to if you just want to see things in writing or you want to see images of these different products in action. That will all be down there as well. So the aim of the game is for people to feel super confident after watching this video on tackling those buttonholes, and hopefully even for you experienced sewers out there you'll pick up a few handy and useful tips or tools that might make life easier for you. So let's get started with the most important and crucial thing with regards to getting good results every time, and that is to test. So we always say test on scraps of fabric first, and this is so important with buttonholes. But there's a few things that you need to bear in mind. So firstly, make sure that you're testing on the same fabric that you're going to be using if possible. If it's not possible, test on something that's very, very similar in terms of the makeup of the fabric, the fibres, the weight, the weave of the fabric, and also try and use the same interfacing that you'll be using on the real garment as well, just to give you a true reflection of how things will behave. The other thing to bear in mind is to make sure that you work with the same number of layers of fabric as well. So if there's going to be several layers of fabric, make sure you mimic that in your test run so that you really are testing like for like. It's a bit like being a bit of a scientist and making sure you've got all of the conditions are the same for the experiment as they will be for the real thing. Also test a couple of times. You know, we've all been there before where you stitch something out, it works perfectly the first time, and then the next time you go to do it, for some reason something goes horribly wrong. So we always say just do at least 2, you know, if not 3 or 4 buttonholes in those control conditions, just to make sure that you're happy with the results. And then finally, cut the buttonhole open and just check that the button does fit through comfortably. It sounds obvious, but it's easily overlooked, so that's always worth doing as well before you head over to start working on your actual garment. So before I get into the products and the different types of fabric and some of the troubleshooting ideas that we've got, I just wanted to quickly recap the difference between a 4-step buttonhole and a 1-step buttonhole, because there are lots of people who might be using a machine with a 4-step buttonhole, and actually once you're aware of how a 1-step buttonhole works, you might actually want to be looking at options for getting a 1-step buttonhole machine. So I just thought I'd enlighten anybody who's not aware of this. But a 4-step buttonhole, you have to measure the button, decide the size of the buttonhole that you need, mark that on the fabric, and then you follow a series of 4 steps to create that buttonhole, essentially sewing each of the 4 sides of the buttonhole. So you'll sew one side, you have to stop at the correct place, then usually you'll turn a dial, stitch the next side, you have to stop at the right place, turn the dial, stitch the next side, and so on. So you have to control the whole process and make sure that you get it the right size. Whereas with a 1-step buttonhole, as the name suggests, it does it all for you. So once you've got your buttonhole selected on the machine and you've got your buttonhole foot on, you press go and it will stitch all 4 sides of the buttonhole out in one go for you. And usually the way that it will know how to do the right size buttonhole is that usually you get a foot like this one, where you insert the button that you'll be using in the back of the foot like I've done there, and that tells the machine what size buttonhole you need, and then you attach the foot to the machine, and as I said, it stitches it all out in one go. So I just thought it was useful to share that in case we've got anybody out there who's using a 4-step buttonhole machine and might be interested in learning about 1-step buttonholes. So 1-step buttonhole machines are fantastic, but there's also another type of 1-step buttonhole machine that I wanted to tell you about, which is the Husqvarna machines. It's from a certain point up. They have a Sensormatic buttonhole foot, which is absolutely incredible. And I've got one on my machine and I absolutely love it. And I just, again, wanted to share this with you because it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of technology. And I just thought people might be interested to see it in action. So with my machine, you've got a handy little gauge on the bottom of the machine where you can measure the size of your button. You then use the touch screen to select the size of button. Once you've selected the buttonhole, you then select the size of button based on what you've read it to be on that guide. You then attach the buttonhole foot. There's a little wire that you click into the machine. And then there's a little wheel on the side of the foot that you have to make sure is in the correct position. But then once you've done all of that and set it up, you put the foot down and go, and it stitches out the right size buttonhole. And the first time I used this machine and this foot on this machine, I was absolutely blown away at how clever it was. There was no faffing with buttons in the back of feet or what have you. So I just thought it was an interesting thing to share with you guys because, you know, you might not be aware of some of the fantastic features that Husqvarna machines have. I've got 2 Husqvarna machines. I'm very, very lucky. But if you ever wanted any more information on those, or from what point upwards you can get those feet on those machines and all the other fantastic features, you can just get in touch with us, drop us an email, give us a call, and we'll be happy to talk through it. But like I said as well, all of the machines we sell are on our website, and the link to our website's below. So now we've discussed the types of buttonholes and the ways different machines work, let's get into the nitty-gritty of some of those problems you might come up against, some of the most common problems you might face when sewing machine sewn buttonholes. So the first one I want to tackle is when you're working with thicker or bulkier fabrics, or you're working in an area on a garment where it's quite thick and bulky, so it might be near the edge of the fabric or near a seam, for example, if you're sewing a coat or some jeans or something like that. It can be quite difficult to get good results then, because often you're sewing across an area that's got 4 layers of fabric in one place and then 2 layers of fabric in another place, and your machine and the foot will be struggling to have anything to work against in some of those instances. Or the front of the foot might be under several layers of fabric and the back of the foot can be hanging off the edge with nothing to work against. And there's a few different things you can try in those instances, but the first one I want to mention to you, which is really cheap and cheerful but a really good tool to have in your sewing arsenal, is one of these, which is known as a humper jumper. Or a bulky seam aid, depending on what you want to call it. It's known as both of those things, and it's just a really simple bit of plastic, very inexpensive. We sell non-branded ones and branded ones on our site. As I said at the beginning, you can find the link to our site and all these products below. But the way this works is you just slip it under the back of the machine foot, and then that evens everything out when you're sewing the buttonhole. So if you're sewing on a bulky area, if you slip that under the back or at the side, it'll just even things out and give the machine something to work against so it can sew that buttonhole. You can't use this with a 1-step buttonhole foot. You can only use it with a standard presser foot. So just bear that in mind. You will have to manually sew the buttonhole in those instances, but it will help you to get really good results and just have a lot more control generally in those difficult and tricky situations. And these are just generally good as well for when you're sewing bulky seams and that sort of thing. Any of those instances where, you know, the machine's really struggling to work with the different thicknesses or the extra thickness of fabric, one of these can come in really handy. Now, another option you've got in those instances as well is just to cut a little square of the fabric and position that in between the 2 layers of fabric where the buttonhole is going to be sewn, and then you could just tack that in place, or you could glue it with some fabric glue depending on how traditional you are. I know some people would hate the idea of using fabric glue, but other people are quite relaxed about it. But you can just slip that inside the 2 layers and that gives you that stability as well, so that's another option. If you're working with a fabric that, for example, has got a pile like velvet, or it's like a fluffy or thicker fabric where you think the stitches might really sink into the fabric, a good idea here is to use a stabiliser on the right side, a washaway stabiliser on the top of the fabric. So I've got an example of that here. So as you can see, I've sewn the buttonhole. It's like a thick ponty fabric, and I've just used this washaway stabiliser on the top, and that just prevents those stitches from sinking into that fabric. And then you can simply soak that away afterwards. We sell loads of different stabilisers on our website, and when it comes to sewing buttonholes, stabilisers and interfacing are your friends. You can find them all on our website, the links are below. But that's a really good tip if you're working with those sorts of fabrics. I would always interface the wrong side of the fabric as well, just to give it that stability. And in most cases, when you're sewing buttonholes, you would always want to interface the wrong side of the fabric just to give it some stability, because buttonholes are sewn with very dense zigzag stitches, so you need to give the fabric a bit more stability to be able to take that. And I would always recommend using an interfacing that's a similar weight to the fabric that you're working with. If you're working with something sheer or very, very lightweight, like chiffon, for example, you might not want to put interfacing on it, but again, these washaway stabilisers can come in really handy in those instances. You could just put some of it inside the fabric where you're going to be sewing the buttonhole, in between the 2 layers. Just put a little piece of it, and then once you've finished your garment, you know, that will soak away and dissolve. So that's another option for you there as well. So hopefully that's given you some good tips for when you're working with those thicker and trickier, bulkier areas when you're sewing buttonholes. Once you've sewn your beautiful buttonholes, they're all stitched out perfectly, you can breathe a sigh of relief, but then you've got to cut the things open, and that can be just as heart-stopping, because if you've ever done it, it can be the most soul-destroying thing. If you go to cut a buttonhole open and you cut through the buttonhole, you cut too far, it's just a disaster. It's something we all want to avoid. So I've got a couple of tips here for you to avoid that. The first one is, if you are using a seam ripper or scissors to cut your buttonholes open, which personally I'd rather not do because I don't trust myself, I can be a bit clumsy, but if you are doing that, then a handy little tip is to do what I've done on this sample here, and that is to just place a couple of pins in the short edges, just inside the short edges of the buttonhole, and the metal will then stop you from cutting too far with your seam ripper or your nail scissors. So that's a really handy tip. But if, like me, you don't really even want to leave that to chance because you just don't trust yourself, then this can be your best friend. This is a buttonhole cutter, so this is the one I use. It's a clover one. It's just got a sharp edge at the end there, and then a plastic handle here. And you can use this. They come in various different sizes. We sell cheaper alternatives on the website as well. As I mentioned, all the products I'm talking about today are available on the website. But you just position that with you put a piece of wood or something similar underneath your fabric, position that in the relevant place for the buttonhole, and then give it a good old whack with a hammer, which is quite therapeutic for some reason. I quite enjoy doing that, and that will create your buttonholes, and you don't run that risk of cutting through the stitches. So that's a really good tip as well, and I wouldn't be without mine. Once you've done all of that, you're pretty much on home turf. You know, you're through, you've done it, you've created those buttonholes, you've cut them open. But there's a couple of other little tips as well related to buttons and buttonhole sewing that I just wanted to share with you. So going back a couple of stages, if you are spacing out buttonholes and you want to get them evenly spaced, sometimes you can use the markings on the pattern pieces. So a little tip here that I always use, if the pattern piece has got the buttonholes marked on and I'm happy with them, I will push a pin through the place where the buttonhole is marked on the pattern, through both layers of fabric. Once I've cut my pattern pieces out, I'll push that through both layers of fabric, and then I'll just lift the tissue up and just mark where the pin is on both sides of the fabric. So then I've got my marking for where my buttonhole or my button needs to be. So I find that quite useful. But sometimes you might want to decide your own spacing, or you might want to add a few. You know, you might not have any markings on whatever you're making, and in those instances you want one of these bad boys, which is a Simplex sewing gauge. I've got one of these. I absolutely love it. So many other people I know have tried them and love them, and it's just a really, really simple contraption. It just helps you to get even spacing of buttonholes, so you can lay it out on the fabric and see that you're going to get perfectly spaced buttonholes lengthways, but also there are little markings on it. I don't know whether you can see those just across there as well, so that enables you as well to be aware of how far across you're positioning buttonholes, and then you can just use them for a whole host of other things as well: crafts, pleats, smocking, you know, anything that you might want to do where you want to create evenly spaced things, perhaps pin tucks. You know, you can use one of these gauges, and they are just really, really handy to have, and it's just quite nice doing this. I feel a bit like an accordion player doing that, but they're really super useful to have as well. The other thing I think it's worth talking about here as well is the button thickness. So sometimes you might measure a button and think that you've got the size exactly right, and then find when you come to push the button through the buttonhole, hopefully on your test mock-up that you've done, that it doesn't quite fit. And sometimes this can be due to the thickness of the button, because obviously that isn't taken into account, especially with dome-shaped buttons. If you measure across the diameter of a dome-shaped button and then you measure across the dome, you'll find that the dome measurement will be slightly longer than the diameter measurement. So in these instances you might need to just make your buttonhole slightly bigger than would be suggested by the size of the button. So that's always worth mentioning as well. The other thing I wanted to mention is button sewing feet. I discovered these when I made a sundress in the summer, and I sewed 14 buttonholes on this dress, and I thought, I love a bit of hand sewing, I love sewing a hem, but whether I want to sit there and sew 14 buttons on, I'm not sure, because I find sewing buttons on quite boring, which is when I discovered the button sewing foot. And these are fantastic. They're available for lots of different machines, but you just slot it onto your machine, you position it over the button, and it just does a lovely neat stitch back and forth and sews the button onto the fabric. But it takes into account the right tension as well, because you can sew a button on too tight or too loose so it's dangly and flopping around, and the button sewing feet help you to avoid that. So that was my new best friend when I sewed a lovely sewing dress last summer. And then finally, something else that I thought I'd share as well is that sometimes you can sew a buttonhole and then you're not quite happy with it, it just doesn't look substantial enough. Obviously you can choose different types of buttonhole and you can adjust your stitches sometimes depending on the machine, but a little tip here is if you're not happy with it and you just want it to look a little bit more substantial, it's always worth considering sewing it twice. Just go over it again. And again, you know, as long as you've tested that in those control conditions we talked at the start of the video, then you'll get great results from that as well, and you can just check you're happy with it. So they're all our top tips. I hope that you've enjoyed that today. I hope you've learnt about some new things, some new techniques, some new tools that might make your life easier, and I hope that you have lots and lots of fun sewing lots and lots of beautiful buttonholes. As always, if you like what you see, please like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.